There you go. Go on.
Hello, and welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society and also sponsor of this program. And with me today is my co-host, Arlene Sachs. And Arlene is one of the founders of this program and a longtime host. So welcome, Arlene.
Thank you.
And our special guest today is Ann Bolon. And Ann is the owner of Ann B. History, and we're going to talk today about writing your family story. And oh gosh, I wish my family had done that. My ancestors left no notes, no journals, nothing. And so as a genealogist, I've had to depend completely on documents. And you can get a lot out of that, but you can't get the story beneath it. All of the hardships and the happiness and all of the relationships of what went into their family story. And so we're delighted to welcome Ann today. And Ann, how did you get started in this?
Well, before I started my business doing oral history interviews, I was in the museum field for 25 years. And when you're in the museum field, you use whatever you can to try and understand another time and a place. Maybe you have artifacts, maybe you have clothes, maybe you have a quilt, maybe you have documents or books, and hopefully oral histories. And you have to be a detective and use all those clues to try and guess what someone's life was like. Well, I'm a pattern seeker, and I thought, well, what if we asked someone directly and then had that account of their life be the thing that gets passed down? So not only do you have the facts and dates, but you could have the personal experience and the memories.
But you've actually used her.
Yes, yes. Well, I was just going to say, in full disclosure, I actually commissioned Ann. My husband is hard to buy for, and so for his birthday, I actually gave him this opportunity to document his life story with Ann. And it's turned out to be a really good thing. We're not even finished yet, are we?
Right, no, I love that we broke it down into topics. And I always say the smaller the topic, the better the story. Because genealogy is often the skeleton, but the personal history behind it, I think, really fills out the story. And so since Mike was such a dedicated genealogist, he's dug up wonderful family stories about motivations and opinions and experiences. But then we also documented his own childhood. We're going to also talk about his military career. We're going to talk about his relationship stories, because all of that fills out who he was as a person and what the 20th century was like for him. That's going to be an amazing document, not just for your own family, but to leave behind as an opinion of what life really was like. Because I think that's what we're trying to understand. What did our family go through? Why did they make the choices that they made? And sometimes you have to get those from a first-hand source.
Yes, and so often you hear something and it makes absolutely no sense unless you know the context of the history in which somebody is talking about. So whether it's World War II and somebody relates something, or to us, if somebody says something about they went in a carriage, or they have so many different names of carriages, or these two-wheel things or three-wheel, to us they don't mean much, but they were certainly important to the people, and that helps you understand what somebody is saying or what somebody has written in books.
It's so true. I am really fighting the word called presentism, which means putting our modern thoughts and opinions on things and experiences that happened in the past. And especially when we have different views about things, it's hard to understand, why would you have made that choice? Why would you have thought this was okay or this was not okay? And you need those, I would say it's kind of like a boots on the ground view. What was it like to go through? You can read a ship's manifest, which is wonderful. That's the date and the ship and the place that your ancestor may have chosen. Why did you leave that day? What was the hardest thing that you came across? And I'm always surprised. Often people's recollections of a different time or place are not what I would have assumed. Almost everyone that's told me about their World War II experience, they had very different fears than we had today. They had very different opinions of how the war affected their life. And I find it amazing how wrong I often guess on what that experience would have been like. So you really need that variety of story. And when you can save a variety of stories, then it turns our national narrative into something just really rich and wonderful and varied.
So that kind of brings up the next question, which is, what is the genealogical value of doing this?
Right. Well, I think the best part about when you are coming at it from a genealogy standpoint, you often are trying to confirm facts, get down some dates, but what we're really trying to find out is who we are. Where did we come from? How did your life affect my life? I think one of my favorite questions I like to ask someone, especially if they are close to the generation that chose to immigrate, is, do you know the history of your family name? Because you know how hard it is to track name changes, things like that from different languages, different cultures. I spoke to someone that escaped Albania when he was 13, and I asked him, do you know the history of your family name? He said, yes, we chose it. This was the person that invented his family name because they have a patronymic tradition in their culture, and he could recite, and he had taught his son to recite back 33 generations
Oh my goodness.
of the names in the family. And I thought, I'm talking to the person that invented the name. That's amazing.
very interesting, because I thought most people had names by the 1800s, and they forced the Jews to take last names. In Napoleon actually decreed that in 1792, and that moved further west, east. So the further east you went, it was later. But I'm surprised that in Albania in the 20th century that people still didn't have last names.
Well, I've also spoken to several people that came from Vietnam and escaped in the 70s. And I talked to one woman, she was only 13 years old. They escaped the day that Saigon fell, and they wanted to get their story down for their children because their parents had started to forget their escape story. She had 13 brothers and sisters. Her name in Vietnamese in English is spelled exactly the same name as her brother, but without the correct accent mark, the names mean completely different things. One means beautiful, one means brave. And you know, how she pronounced her name, and I'm probably not saying it right, but it's Zheng. But she goes by Christina. So you need to have that tradition if you can get it, especially if it's from a non-Western culture or a country with a different alphabet or lettering system. So I think you get down those facts that you can, but also the experience. What was it like to live without electricity? What was it like to live in a different culture? I love to ask, what were you scared of? Those are things that are different for every culture and every decade.
And especially for the people, for the immigrants, because they were certainly escaping something. Nobody came here because things were good for them. So everybody has a story of why they came, whether it's just to make a better life, or whether they were afraid of being killed, or whether there were pogroms, or all the things that are happening now in our own hemisphere.
It's very true.
You know,
But a lot of people would say, who wants to know my story? My kids aren't interested. You know, I'm just an ordinary person living in the 20th, 21st century. And so why write my story? What's the value of that?
I think that's a wonderful question, because I think it's quite opposite. My experience has 100% been that it's opposite than what people assume. Being interested in a family story is different from being interested in taking up the mantle of genealogy. I have found that almost all adult children are constantly asking their parents, please tell me your story, which is different than doing the research. They really want, especially when they have their own children, there's kind of a moment in your mid-40s when you realize, I was a person before I was a parent. I bet my parents were people before they were mom and dad. And I want my children to know my parents or grandparents from their own story. So I find that the children are desperate to hear these stories. And the adults and the people that are generally kind of retirees think they don't have a story. and they think it's not worth it. I talked to a man just yesterday at a genealogy fair who told me his story wasn't interesting, it wasn't different from anyone else's story. I had told him about speaking with this family that escaped from Vietnam. He'd been a naval officer that had picked everyone up off the boats. He probably personally saved the lives of thousands of people, and his response was, my story's not interesting. I want everyone to understand that simply living through the 20th century means you have seen incredible change, and we have something to learn from you.
That's right, and our children, or even just strangers, may want to know something about what life was like in our era.
I'll tell you a story that my kids, when they were teenagers, were sitting with my mother-in-law in the living room, and I was sort of had a half an ear out, but I was doing something else. And they said, what do you really remember from when you were little? And I thought, and I guess they did that because they knew I was a genealogist, and I don't know what prompted them to ask that. And I could not believe my mother-in-law's answer, because her answer was watching the Wright brothers demonstrate their airplane. And it just blew my mind. Here was a woman that had lived from before we had airplanes to well into space exploration that we're doing. She died in 2000. So we then asked my mother the same question, because they were very close in age. And sure enough, my mother gave, although she grew up a half continent, my mother was from Germany, the same kind of answer. She said, my father once took me to the airport and we watched the airplanes land. So this probably was during World War I. And I thought, my God, these women, and they, other than that, they lived relatively normal, what we'd call normal housewife type lives.
Which to me is incredibly interesting. How did you cook? What did you cook? What was a family celebration like?
Yeah.
I spoke with a woman who actually was born in the late 30s in the Netherlands, and she does not remember being scared of World War II because of the way that her mother, despite, she said she would gather the family together when she knew there was going to be a bombing raid and say, oh, let's have a song. And so the children did not feel scared of the war. However, she still remembers the sound of the boots of people marching. And I like to use, for an example, I have a daughter who's in middle school. She's only 14 years old. And how much, I like to have people raise your hand and say, you have something to teach my daughter. Do you remember the moon landing? My daughter has a Martin Luther King Day assembly every year. Do you remember when he was assassinated? How about remember having to telephone someone? How about remember life before a microwave oven? She can't conceive, how would you cook if there wasn't a microwave oven? And she doesn't understand, raise your hand if you could have been fired as a woman, if you were, there were nurses or teachers that could be fired for simply being married. A lot of women could have been fired for becoming pregnant at work. I don't want her to remember the grievances, but I want her to celebrate progress and changes in ideals, because it's very hard for her to understand why other generations would react in a certain way, and that's a very important thing to preserve.
And growing up in the 60s, I mean, I was a teenager in the 60s. Just think about the stories that can be told in the 60s and how rapidly the whole society was changing. Here's another one. I was in the banking business, and I was able to get into management positions as a woman. That was rare in those days. And what were the experiences that I had? And you see movies and stuff about it now, but wouldn't it be interesting to tell my own story about how I was able to advance?
But even looking back at my own experience in working, I can see where there was discrimination, although I didn't think of it at that point. So, a male was hired after me, less experienced, but he got more money.
Sure.
And it happened a couple of times. It didn't really, well, he had his degree. Well, I still had, and I was working on my last math degree to get my degree. Well, you don't have your degree, even though I had more experience than he did. So all sorts of things like that. But I've got a funny story to tell. My son considers somebody older than him by the moon landing because I made him stay up, and that's all he can remember. Is that I kept shaking him. You can't go to sleep. You can't go to sleep. He was 6 years old, I guess, or close to 6, and I made him stay up and watch that because I knew he would remember that, and to this day he remembers it.
And we have seminal moments in our culture. The bombing of Pearl Harbor. I spoke to another person yesterday who, again, right out said, well, I don't have an interesting story, except I worked in Lower Manhattan on 9/11.
Wow. Oh, yeah.
That is something we all left. And he said, my daughter teases me. She calls it the day of major inconvenience. He sat down and wrote a 70-page document about what his experience was like. How did he even get home from work? And that, he said, I wasn't interesting. I wasn't a firefighter. I said, imagine if you had that for the assassination of President Lincoln. Imagine if you had that for the Blitzkrieg bombing. What was that like, really? Because that personal experience, those memories and opinions are different from pulling it from genealogy fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, and I do think you can confirm things. When I interview people, I say, is there something you're trying to confirm? But really, the kids desperately, I want to really emphasize, kids desperately, adult children really, really want to hear stories. And I always hear that people think their own story is not important enough to tell.
And so let's talk a little bit about the difference between writing a genealogical report and doing what you do.
Right. So I think, first off, what I do is I help someone come up with a topic. And we talk about their experience on a topic, and then I draft the questions. What I produce is a transcript. So I say it's someone's own story in their own words. Because I think there are a lot of things where we become disconnected from a story. Again, if we leave Hollywood to tell it, my opinions of the Vietnam War are shaped very much by Hollywood, and not enough by the veterans and the people that participated in it. People can't understand that my father was a Navy, served in the Navy during Vietnam, and my mother protested. How did those two people get together? It makes perfect sense when you get to know the person. My mother really wanted to support people not being killed unnecessarily. My father, having served in the military, understood the importance of not going to war. They really had very similar things, and that might not tell the most interesting story by Hollywood. So what I do is I want someone's experience from their perspective, and that's very different often than confirming facts. People often ask me, how do I make sure what someone's telling me is accurate? That's not my motivation. This isn't a legal deposition. This is their opinion and experience. I've never had anyone tell me something inaccurate on purpose because they're telling me their actual experience. And I think that's when you connect with someone heart to heart. I was more moved speaking with a Vietnamese woman who married an American serviceman. When she told me, I asked her if they had a food shortage in her village, and she said it wasn't that they had a food shortage, but they couldn't cook their food. Because if you lit a fire to cook your food, then your village would be fired upon.
The smoke, they could tell where the village
She
was.
had a single tear that went down her cheek that moved me more than any Hollywood movie I've seen. So I think it's a little bit, it's a very different, getting someone's experience is different than fact checking. However, you often are related experiences that help all the facts make sense. When did she leave? Why did she leave? Why did she choose to leave her culture? Why wasn't she allowed to go back and visit her family for 18 years? That's, I think, what connects us as people, and that I'm seeking that generational connection. There's too much division between, young, old, here, there, and when you bring people together like that, you really see them.
Well, you're talking about big things, but even little things that you read about that don't make sense unless you know the historical background of what was going on in those days. And as you had said, I think it was before we were on television, and I've totally lost track of what I was saying, of being able to understand what was going on.
Right. You know, I sat down, I talked with a man who was a World War II vet. He served in Japan and he grew up in California. He had neighbors that were Japanese American that were put
moved.
into internment camps. And I asked him, what was your opinion of that? Not what's your opinion of that in 2019, what was your opinion of that in 1945? And it's different than now.
So from a genealogical standpoint,
Right.
this helps to answer the why, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And it also gives some clues that a genealogist can go back and then fact check. So if somebody in that history says, well, I enlisted, you know, in March of whatever, then the genealogist can go back and fact check that to make sure that, you know, that's correct. Then filling in all of the whys. Why did they immigrate? What was it like the day you enlisted? How did you feel about that? So that is the genealogical story that can be written, and that's the documentation then that can be put into it. And it what makes for a fabulous history of a person.
It does. Well, I think your own husband, Mike, had a perfect example. He was trying to find out about I think it was his grandmother, Emma, right?
Right.
His family had not shared the fact that she was an immigrant. There are everybody now loves that were an immigrant, or loves that they're cultural, you know, perhaps they were Jewish, perhaps they were a different faith, perhaps they were a different culture. There were different decades in America when people purposefully hid that information.
Of course, that's why they changed their names to sound more American.
Right.
And you have that from all of the different cultures. I mean, that, you know, the Irish need not apply because
Exactly.
Right. And Germans, you know, during the wars, if you were German in Texas, you just didn't talk about it that much, you know. And if you were speaking German in the household, you didn't do that anymore.
Well, we did, because my grandmother never learned English. So yes, I grew up with that. And she decided at the ripe old age of 68, which of course was pretty old in those days, that she wasn't going to live long enough to bother learning English. So, she lived to be almost 96. But yeah, it was.
My parents were like, "What do you want to know all that stuff for?"
Yeah, yes,
you know?
absolutely. Especially for the immigrants. Remember, the immigrants came over. They didn't talk about it because they wanted to forget.
Yes.
They left family, they lost family, depending on which era they came. Whether it's the Irish who left people to starve, or the Jews that left the pogroms, or the Italians that came for a better life, or the Germans that came for a better life. You left family. You needed to forget that, so you didn't talk about it. You wanted to forget it. You didn't tell your children. It's just another generation later that we wanted to know where we came from or why why they did this.
Mm-hmm.
People ask me a lot about family secrets, and they want to know, are people, what happens if someone shares a family secret? And again, the reality is very different than when people assume. My generation, you know, if you take people that are 20 or 30 or 40, they have a very different opinion of what a family secret would be. They don't care that there might have been adoptions or previous marriages or things like that, things that other generations felt much more sensitive about. So I don't find that people share family secrets. Part of my process is that I'm very careful to ask someone ahead of time, is there something you don't want to talk about? I've spoken
or
with,
you don't want written up, even if they tell you about it. You don't want it.
And I've talked to, veterans too. Being a veteran, if you've been in combat, can be a nerve-wracking experience. Having those people skills, you watch someone's body language when they become tense or nervous, then you understand their personality and work with them.
Well, we're almost out of time. Anne, did you want to tell the viewers how they could get a hold of you or your website?
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's Anne B History, Anne with an E. You can also look it up under bestfamilystories.com. Definitely look up my email, also annbhistory@gmail. I do all kinds of packages and programs.
This is an example of one of the books, and so you can have them in this format, or you can have this wonderful hardback book, which I thought is really was surprised at how inexpensive the book itself would be to publish.
Yes, the hard part is pulling together and
Yes, of
transcribing
course.
multiple interviews. So.
I would think so. I think we have a few minutes more. Is there anything else that you want to add on the why or?
I'd like to thank Anne very much, and also Arlene. Thank you for co-hosting. And I just want to invite everybody to come to Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We meet the third Wednesdays of every month, and it's mvgenealogy.org, and we would love to have you visit.
And you've got to be careful. One of either the Fairfax one or the Mount Vernon one, if you put down the wrong address, it goes to something Oriental, and then you get all sorts of junk. I did that once, and it was I don't know whether it was the Mount Vernon one or the Fairfax, but I came up with this weird thing, and then they started sending me these messages.
Oh, no.
Obviously they had grabbed my. It stopped after a while when I didn't respond to them anymore.